2 Samuel chapter 1. 2 Samuel is a continuous narrative from the end of 1 Samuel. Saul and his 3 sons were killed in the battle with the Philistines at Mount Gilboa. This chapter has a lament for Saul and Jonathan by David when he hears about their death. David hears the news of the death of Saul and Jonathan while in Ziklag, verses 1 to 4. Saul is dead, but David is not yet aware of it. Verse 2. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. Torn clothes and dust on the head are both traditional expressions of anguish, mourning, and grief. This man thus bore all the marks of lamenting. He was also aware who David was, because he bows to him to pay him honor. David certainly was concerned about the outcome of that battle and asked in verse 4, "What happened? Tell me." The man conveyed David the message that Israel had lost the battle and many of them fell and died. The messenger continued saying, "And Saul and his son Jonathan are dead," because it was the message of the greatest importance. This is not what David wanted to hear. Jonathan was his best friend. The Israelites have lost the battle, and Saul, the Lord's anointed, and his sons are dead. The Amalekite story, verses 5 to 10. Verse 5. Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" David wanted to know whether the young man had this information from his own sight and knowledge or by report. He wants the young man to give him proof. It shows the deep interest David had in the war, an interest that sprang from feelings of high and generous patriotism. This young man was an Amalekite and claimed responsibility for Saul's death. He said that he was an eyewitness of the account and that he was the one who killed Saul when he knew that Saul could not survive. Verse 10. His tale of having killed Saul was a lie on the face of it, because verse 6 says, "And there was Saul leaning upon his spear." No man could fall on a spear that is 8 feet long. 1 Samuel 31 tells of Saul's suicide by sword, not spear. A sword is a long-bladed weapon having a small handle designed to stab a person. A spear is a long stick with a sharp tip used to throw and thrust upon a person. Due to the great length of the spear as compared with that of the sword, this statement alone is sufficient to prove that the Amalekite was a liar. Leaning on a sword would hardly be attempted by anyone trying to kill himself, especially if he also had a sword. The details of Saul's death in verses 6 to 10 narrated by this messenger was at variance with those of 1 Samuel 31 3 to 5, which says that Saul was wounded by the Philistines and then he fell upon his own sword. This Amalekite young man hoped that the death of both Saul and Jonathan was good news to David, as it would make way for David's ascension to the throne. So he made a false account so as to win David's favor. Actually, this man would have witnessed Saul's suicide when he had gone in the Israelite camp after the battle was over to loot and steal from the dead soldiers anything of value that might be left. 1 Samuel 31:8. He does not tell that to David. He brought the royal crown and handband, the marks of royal dignity, to prove who he was. Amalekites were the people about whom the Lord said that he would be at war with them from generation to generation. Exodus 17:16. Exodus 17:14 says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." Yet Saul, because of his disobedience, did not do so. 1 Samuel 15:9 to 11. If we take the Amalekite story as true, this is a chilling statement. In a unique war of judgment, God commands Saul to completely destroy the people of Amalek. 1 Samuel 15:2-3. Saul failed to do this, and now an Amalekite brought a bitter end to his tragic life. David's reaction, mourning for Saul, verse 11-12. Verse 11. Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. David's extreme grief at the death of the man who tried to kill him for 30 years is astonishing. Proverbs 24:17. But it is consistent with David's belief that Saul was God's anointed. 1 Samuel 24:6. Tearing of clothes is a custom among the Gentiles on mournful occasions. It was a sign of deep mourning. David and all the men tore their clothes in grief. David demonstrates genuine, heartfelt grief for the death of Saul and Jonathan by mourning and weeping as well as fasting, which were common ways to demonstrate grief. In verse 12, the army of the Lord means the army of Israel. God had chosen the Israelites as a special nation. Deuteronomy 7:6. The army of Israel fought Israel's enemies and they protected God's people. But the Philistines had defeated the Israelites that day. They had killed many Israelite soldiers. The Israelites felt very sad. They also felt ashamed. David was so overwhelmed with grief that he cried and did not eat food. David's men also followed the example of their leader David and answered Saul's hatred and venom with love. David executes the Amalekite, verses 13-16. Verse 14. David asked him, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Despite Saul's many attempts on David's life, David would not allow himself to see Saul as just a mere man or human monarch. He remained the Lord's anointed who occupied a sacred role before God, and so David gave great respect and honor. It really does not matter whether the Amalekite story of killing Saul is true or not. Whatever it is, this Amalekite was not a Hebrew. He was a foreigner. He did not understand about not raising his hand against the Lord's anointed. David had no doubt of this Amalekite's guilt and goes on to punish him. David didn't put a false display of grief and then secretly honor the man who killed Saul. Verse 15. Then David called one of his men and said, "Go, strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. This most certainly came as a great surprise to the Amalekite, for he intended to win the favor of David by saying he had killed Saul. What made David take this decision? David must have consulted with the Lord during his fast to find out what to do with this Amalekite man. So, this judgment of striking the Amalekite was from God. The Lord's instruction to the people of Israel concerning the Amalekites to blot them from under heaven was very specific. Deuteronomy 25:19. As the king, David was responsible for carrying out God's commands, and his first order of business was to do what God told him to do. Verse 16. For David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" David executed the Amalekite on the basis of his own testimony, not on the basis of the truthfulness of his story. David acted as a judge. He showed that he had the right to order the Amalekite man's death. This also showed the Israelites that David was not Saul's enemy. David always respected and protected Saul. Except for justified killing in war, self-defense, or lawful criminal execution, it is God's job to end a life, not ours. This is true of every human life, but it is even truer of the life and ministry of the Lord's anointed. Introduction to the Song of the Bow, verses 17-18. Verse 17. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan. Israel's first king and his sons are dead. This was a sad time for the whole nation of Israel. David chose to have both Saul and his noble son Jonathan remembered through this lament sung in the form of a poem which would be taught to all Israel as a national war song. Verse 18. And he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasher. The book of Jasher is probably a record of the poetic collection of Israel's national poems and songs. Joshua 10:13. The bow in the title of the poem may have been chosen with reference to Jonathan, whose bow is mentioned in verse 22. The people of Judah were taught this lament of the bow. Since Saul was injured by an arrow from a bow, David trains his men in the bow to prepare themselves for future wars. The Hebrew poems are often in picture language. This style helped them to describe their emotions. They often wrote two similar lines of poetry to describe one fact. As you read verses 19 to 27, remember that it is a poem. Then try to imagine how David and the Israelites felt. Song of the Bow, verses 18 to 28. It is a classic funeral dirge from which many dirges and eulogies have been adapted. The lament, How the Mighty Have Fallen, is the key refrain in the song and brackets the entire poem for emphasis. Verses 19, 25 and 27. This forms the chorus of the song. David's sorrow was sincere and deeply felt. He sang the song to express the depth of his feeling. Despite Saul's poor leadership and repeated efforts to kill David, it is fascinating to see that David eulogized Saul in glowing terms and did not mention any of his faults. This generous commendation about Saul shows David's generous and forgiving attitude, a model of gracious love. Matthew 5:43 to 48. David celebrates the qualities and deeds of Saul and Jonathan in this song. It is one of the most eloquent eulogies in the Bible. The song begins and ends with Saul's noble son Jonathan. Verse 19. A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel. How the mighty have fallen. A gazelle is a graceful little antelope that's native to Africa and Asia. These elegant, long-legged animals was a symbol of youthful elegance. Here it refers to Jonathan. The battle had been on the heights of Israel, that is, the mountains of Gilboa. The Philistines had completely defeated the Israelites and killed their mighty king and his sons. This was a terrible time for the whole nation of Israel. Verse 20. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. David deprecates the spread of such news. In course of time, this expression became a proverb. Micah 1:10. Gath and Ashkelon were important Philistine cities. Gath was situated in the eastern part of the Philistine territory, while Ashkelon was in the west by the sea. Women usually sang and danced when the army returned from a successful battle. The Philistines now had won the battle against the Lord's army. They had killed the king whom God had anointed. They had also killed the king's sons. If this is known, the Philistines probably would think that they had defeated Israel's God. David did not want the Philistine people to know this. He did not want Israel's enemy to be happy and rejoice at the calamities of Israel, as the women of Israel had rejoiced and danced at the defeat of the Philistines when David killed Goliath. 1 Samuel 18:7. David could not stand thinking of the uncircumcised Philistines gloating over the victory over Israel. Verse 21. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain. May no showers fall on your terraced fields. Since Saul and Jonathan died in Mount Gilboa, David spoke a curse seeking the absence of dew or rain upon this mountain. He wants them to be aware of the Lord's displeasure in the defamation of the character of God's anointed. David is praying to God to withhold the crops from the Philistines. For there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. The Israelites made shields from leather and wood. They rubbed oil into the leather to make it strong, Isaiah 21:5, to prevent the leather from being hard and cracked. These shields protected them from arrows, spears, and stones. But this shield of the mighty was despised because the Philistines must have broken Saul's shield. Thus, this shield was not able to save his life. A shield being despised was counted a national disgrace. There on Mount Gilboa lay the shield of Saul, dried out without oil, a symbol of defeat and death. Saul and Jonathan were great soldiers and mighty warriors. While they were alive, they killed many enemies. David remembers all the times when Saul and Jonathan had great success in their battles. They had come back from many battles with the blood of the enemy upon their swords. Now, their swords and their shields were in the possession of the Philistines. Bow, sword, these two weapons were used by Saul and Jonathan with much power, accuracy, and effectiveness. It was also with the bow that Jonathan helped David escape Saul's wrath. 1 Samuel 20:35-42. Though Jonathan had helped David in the past, yet Jonathan remained loyal to King Saul, his father. Even though Saul knew he would lose his life in this battle, he did not run and hide. He fought a brave soldier. Jonathan was near to Saul during this battle. They died as they fought together against Israel's enemy. They were strong, brave, and mighty. They were swifter than eagles in pursuing their enemies and executing their designs, which was a great commendation in a prince and a requisite quality in a warrior. They were stronger than lions. They were more courageous than lions. According to Agag's observation, Proverbs 30:30, the lion never retreats himself to fight, but faces his foe to the last. In verse 24, the women of Israel are commanded to grieve over the loss of him who had adorned them in scarlet and placed ornaments of gold upon their garments. This shows that Israel was very prosperous during the years of Saul's monarchy. In verse 26, David sorrowed over Jonathan as he would a brother. There is no hint of an inappropriate or sexual relationship as some modern translators allege. The commitment shared between the two of them was a noble, loyal and selfless devotion, 1 Samuel 18:3, which neither of them had ever felt for a woman. Their love was compellingly strong. In verse 27, weapons of war is a figurative expression referring to Saul and Jonathan. The poem ends with words about defeat. This was a very sad time for Israel. Chapter 1. Questions and Answers.